Over the course of life on our planet, the process of evolution has resulted in some pretty remarkable organisms. Giant terrestrial dinosaurs, enormous marine reptiles, the unbelievable diversity of invertebrates, and so much more. One thing that becomes clear when looking back at the fossil record is that when an animal becomes good at doing a certain thing, it often becomes copied by other lineages that end up doing that same thing. It's called convergent evolution, and it's much more common than you might realise. Convergent evolution makes a lot of sense when you think about it. If a certain body plan, or even a certain part of anatomy, enables a group of organisms to be successful in whatever niche or habitat they're occupying, then of course an unrelated group of organisms occupying that same niche or habitat, perhaps at a different point in time, is going to end up evolving similar features, as the traits that best enable survival and reproduction are selected for. So when you take a look through the vast depths of time at all the organisms that have ever lived on Earth in the past, it's really no surprise that convergence is rampant throughout the fossil record. One of my favourite examples, though, is the case of the repeatedly evolving turtles. Now, before we take a very brief look at how turtles evolved, I should warn you that once you go down the turtle evolution rabbit hole, it's a path you cannot return from. I did a video on the evolution of turtles and the evolution of sea turtles in particular a few years ago, and trust me, it's a nightmare to get your head around. Trying to understand this particularly complex and convoluted evolutionary history quite literally gave me a headache at certain points, but fear not, for I've tried to simplify this and distill it down as much as possible, so that you don't have to suffer like I did. Also note that I'm using the catch-all term turtle to refer to what we in Britain would distinguish as turtles, terrapins and tortoises. Together they're all members of the testudines, and so to keep things simple I'll be referring to them all in the American way, as turtles. For a long time there was a great mystery concerning what kind of reptiles turtles really are. This is because of their unusual anatomy compared to other living reptiles, and in particular due to aspects of their skull anatomy. Turtle skulls have what is known as the anapsid condition, where there are no openings present towards the back of the sides of the skull. This contrasts with the synapsid condition, in which there is one opening present, and the diapsid condition, with two openings. All other living reptiles belong to the diapsids, whereas mammals evolved from a lineage within the synapsids. But turtles were for a long time thought by scientists to represent the only surviving branch of the anapsids, and therefore to be very distantly related to all other living reptiles. That view of turtle relationships has since changed though, with more recent molecular evidence and more data from the fossils we're about to take a look at, proving that turtles are actually diapsids that later lost both of these back openings of the skull, therefore converging on the anapsid condition. But they aren't anapsids. Anyway, the lineage leading to turtles potentially first appeared during the Permian period, the last period just before the age of the dinosaurs, as suggested by a species called Unnotosaurus, which lived between about 266 to 260 million years ago. This species does appear to resemble what you might expect the first stages of turtle evolution to look like, with flattened and expanded ribs that are connected to the vertebrae of the back. So it's starting to look almost like a shell, although it's not yet a true shell. Unnotosaurus has therefore been recovered as a potential stem turtle, a term used to indicate that it's not a true member of the testudines, but sits along the stem of the branch leading to them. However, other studies have found Unnotosaurus to not be a stem turtle and instead to place elsewhere among reptiles, and for now at least, disagreement continues over its placement. The next most ancient stem turtle we currently know of is a mid-Triassic species called Papocalis, which lived around 240 million years ago. The description of Papocalis in 2015 was a very significant step in figuring out the early evolution of testudines, as the fossils of this species show how the shell most likely evolved. Papocalis was quite wide, again with broad ribs and also very thick belly ribs, or gastralia. These gastralia were sometimes fused to one another, hinting at the beginnings of a plastron, the name given to the underside of the turtle's shell. Interestingly, Papocalis has also been interpreted as a burrowing or possibly amphibious animal, which shows that the turtle shell might have originated in more terrestrially inclined animals than had been previously suggested by others who proposed they evolved in fully aquatic settings. Anyway, the evolutionary position of Papocalis is also somewhat of a discussion too, with other researchers finding it to sit elsewhere on the reptile family tree, but still it does seem like a pretty good candidate for a very ancient stem turtle. The next most ancient stem turtle we currently know of is a species called Eorhynchochelis, named in 2018 based on a fossil found in 228 million-year-old Triassic rocks in China. This particular species is very interesting for having an unusual mixture of more derived, or advanced, turtle-like features, as well as more basal or primitive ones. The nearly complete fossil found of this stem turtle shows that it again had quite broad and flat ribs, but there was no true carapace or plastron yet. Additionally, the small skull possesses small teeth towards the back of the jaws, whereas the front is actually completely toothless, forming an edentulous beak that would have been extended by a keratinous covering in life. This was actually somewhat of a surprise for paleontologists, as another stem turtle that lived after Eorhynchochelis, called Odontochelis, clearly had teeth at the front of its upper and lower jaws. So turtle evolution was quite a mosaic process, with derived as well as more basal features turning up in these stem turtles. Eorhynchochelis therefore potentially represents a sort of side branch of stem turtles that lost their front teeth and developed beaks earlier on than other branches. Stem turtles were also likely evolving in a semi-aquatic context by this time too, as Eorhynchochelis has some features of its ankle bones that might suggest it was adapted for swimming, and the fossil was found in marine sediments. However, there are also signs of a possible terrestrial lifestyle too. The anatomy of the upper limb bones of Eorhynchochelis seem to suggest that this animal was adapted for digging, and the relatively large claws would be consistent with this too. As such, the paleontologists hypothesized that perhaps this was a coastal water inhabitant, foraging on both land as well as in the seas, digging into mud with its strong limbs and claws. Odontochelis, meanwhile, was also found in Triassic Age rocks in China dating to around 220 million years ago, and in addition to a full mouth of teeth and no beak, also has a fully formed plastron. This is some incredible evidence showing that the underside of the turtle shell actually evolved before the carapace did. Odontochelis does show the beginnings of a carapace though, possessing broad dorsal ribs as well as a few fused plates running down the spine, and showing that these are the first elements to form, evidence that is indeed reflected in studies of the embryonic development of the carapace in living turtles. Stem turtles were still inhabiting aquatic environments at this time too, with Odontochelis being found in a formation that represents a nearshore marine or river delta habitat. A very recently published study finds further support for an aquatic lifestyle, performing isotopic analyses on the fossils of Odontochelis and finding that it was at least semi-aquatic and probably fully aquatic by this point, living in a marine-influenced setting, not just a freshwater one. This research also found Odontochelis to be herbivorous, feeding in a similar fashion to the modern green sea turtle and the marine iguana, eating algae growing in coastal areas. Interestingly then, this seems to show that the plastron was a feature of turtles that evolved in marine settings. Next up in the chronology of turtle evolution is one that for a very long time was the oldest definite stem turtle that we actually knew of, until the discovery of all these other species in the last decade or so. Proganochelis is another Triassic animal, living about 215 million years ago and known from fossils found in Germany and Switzerland, and first named in 1887. This animal was very turtle-like in its overall appearance, with a fully formed carapace and plastron, plus a toothless beak, and so it's understandable that the origins of turtles were obscured for so long when Proganochelis was the most obvious stem turtle we knew of, since it already looks so much like later true turtles. Now, I could do a whole video on the evolution of turtles after the Triassic, and I might if people would like to see that, as there are all sorts of fascinating extinct groups to look at, including a lineage of stem group turtles that survived until just a few thousand years ago, the Maolaniids, and there's also the origins of the living turtle clades. Turtles today are split into two major groups, Pleurodira, or the side-necked turtles, which retract their necks by moving them to the side and tucking their heads in front of the shoulder girdle, and Cryptodira, which retract their heads straight back, tucking it within the shoulder girdle. Plus there are many other differences between Pleurodires and Cryptodires too. So definitely much more to discuss, but this is just a brief overview of the early stages of turtle evolution, trying to simplify as much as possible the journey of how turtles became turtles. But now that you hopefully know what they are and how they came to be, what about all the other times that things became turtles? Because, wow, evolution really likes turtles. The first lineage of not turtles that we're going to look at is a group called Saurosphargidae. These reptiles are only known from a few species, all of which lived during the first half of the Triassic period, from around 251 to 243 million years ago. So, interestingly, these are the first known animals to evolve the turtle body plan, with the first completely shelled stem turtles not appearing until later in the Triassic. And so, really, it's the true turtles that are the turtle mimics, when you think about it for too long. I did warn you that turtle evolution was a path to madness. Anyway, Saurosphargids are a really fascinating group of reptiles with a very interesting story. The first one to be found and scientifically described was Saurosphargis in 1936, which was uncovered in rocks in Poland. Immediately, the turtle similarities were obvious to paleontologists, despite the fossil being quite fragmentary, with a flat and wide body with very thick ribs that were all close together, forming a sort of basket structure, and then osteoderms over the top. These turtle similarities were so strong that the paleontologist who first described it thought that Saurosphargis might actually represent a turtle ancestor. Unfortunately, this type and only known specimen of Saurosphargis was then destroyed in 1945 during a World War II bombing raid, and it wouldn't be until much later, the 21st century in fact, that the Saurosphargid story continued. 2003 saw the naming of an animal called Saurosphargis from mid-Triassic aged rocks in northern Italy, which was found by paleontologists to be related to another mysterious Triassic reptile called Helveticosaurus. These two reptiles were thought to be positioned as fairly close relatives of Saurosphargis itself, based on comparisons with the description of the lost fossil. Again, there was then a bit of a hiatus in Saurosphargid research, but not nearly as long as the last one, until 2011 when a new species was named, Saurosphargis. The fossils of this species were found in rocks in southwestern China, and they revealed a lot of much needed information about these strange reptiles, with an almost complete and fully articulated specimen being found. Saurosphargis is really very turtle-like. Again, the body is very broad and flat, with broad dorsal ribs that contact each other to form a dorsal rib basket, as well as a compact and thickened gastral basket on the underside, almost like a convergent plastron. Many small osteoderms are present over the back, creating a flexible shield structure. A well-preserved forelimb also shows that these small osteoderms extend down the arms, which themselves were fairly paddle-like and clearly adapted for aquatic locomotion. The skull is also quite interesting, possessing distinctively shaped teeth and having nostrils retracted back from the snout tip, and the upper temporal opening has also been secondarily closed. The paleontologists describing Saurosphargis looked at the classification of these reptiles, finding Saurosphargis and Saurosphargis to group together as Saurosphargids, whereas Saurosphargis was actually somewhat confusingly not a Saurosphargid, and groups with Helveticosaurus as their own thing. The classification of Saurosphargis has since changed again somewhat, but it's still definitely not a Saurosphargid, so we'll leave it there. Saurosphargids were also now fully recognised as a distinct lineage of turtle-mimicking marine reptiles, and they were found to be possible relatives of the Thalattosaurs, a lineage of Triassic marine reptiles, as well as the Sauropterygians, the major group including the famous Plesiosaurs, Pliosaurs, Nothosaurs, and some other turtle mimics we'll be looking at next. 2012 then saw the publication of a new species called Largocephalosaurus polycarpon, again from the mid-Triassic of southwestern China. This fossil comprises an almost complete skeleton, just missing the tail, and includes most of the skull. Although it was at first just considered to be some sort of indeterminate Sauropterygian, the next year paleontologists described a second species, Largocephalosaurus chianensis, which they used to show that both species were actually members of Saurosphargidae. Interestingly, Largocephalosaurus is less turtle-like than Saurosphargis, having a narrower, more elongated body and overall appearing less specialized. There were still osteoderms present across the top of the back, but they don't form a complete carapace in these animals. However, they do still have thickened ribs forming a basket structure. Largocephalosaurus therefore seems to show the more basal condition of the Saurosphargids, and then Saurosphargis is more derived, becoming adapted for a lifestyle that required a very turtle-like body plan. What exactly might this lifestyle have been? It's possible that they became specialized for a slower moving bottom-feeding ecology, which might explain the thickened ribs acting as ballast. And this then perhaps made them more vulnerable to attack from predators, creating a selection pressure for the evolution of armor. In the description of the second Largocephalosaurus species, Saurosphargids were again found to be close relatives of the Sauropterygians, and this time closer to them than to the Thalattosaurs. But this picture of Saurosphargid relationships has since changed again, with a very recent paper published in August of 2023 finding that, actually, Saurosphargids are Sauropterygians. This paper describes another new species belonging to this family, Prosaurosphargis, bringing the number of known Saurosphargids up to 5. This taxon is again from China, but this time from even earlier on in the Triassic, earlier than any other Saurosphargid found so far. Saurosphargis is again not nearly as turtle-like as Saurosphargis, with a thin and elongated body, long tail, and no complete carapace, but it does still have osteoderms running in rows along the back, has quite a flat body, and also has expanded ribs, with some of them forming a basket. Saurosphargis adds more to our understanding of these reptiles' anatomy, and as such enables an improved analysis of their position among relatives. The result of this analysis is that Saurosphargids were found to not be close relatives of the Sauropterygians, but actually a lineage of Sauropterygians themselves, echoing the results of some earlier studies. In fact, they were found to be closer to Eosauropterygia, the more derived grouping including the plesiosaurs, nothosaurs, and others, than the Placodonts are, another lineage including some turtle-like members. It's all very fascinating and seems to show that basal Sauropterygians were crazy about turtles, with not just one but two different lineages independently converging on this very similar body plan. Speaking of which, what about the Placodonts then? These reptiles lived from the middle of the Triassic through to the end of the period, from about 245 to 201 million years ago. Many more species of Placodonts are known compared to the Saurosphargids, and they were pretty diverse in morphology, with many looking like turtles but also others that are very different, such as Placodus itself. These reptiles, as I mentioned, have long been accepted to represent a lineage of Triassic Sauropterygians, relatives of the nothosaurs, plesiosaurs, and apparently also quite close to the Saurosphargids. Again, it might therefore be tempting to think, well, if there are two lineages of somewhat turtle-looking reptiles that are pretty close to each other in evolutionary terms, are they not likely to be the same? But again, numerous other differences are found between the Placodonts and Saurosphargids. Plus, we even have fossils of basal members from each group, showing that both lineages started out not very turtle-like, and eventually converged independently on this body plan. In the case of the Placodonts, these basal members include a species named in 2013, called Placodonta from the mid-Triassic of the Netherlands. Various features of the skull and teeth confirm its relationship to Placodonts, allowing paleontologists to place it as a stem Placodont, more technically a Placodontiform. Placodonta shows some key features of its teeth that appear to be intermediate between the basal conditions seen in other diapsid reptiles and the highly specialized unusual teeth of the true Placodonts. These reptiles have some incredible dentitions, possessing massive domed teeth that were perfectly adapted for crushing down on hard-shelled prey items. In some species, most notably Macroplacus from the late Triassic of Germany, these crushing teeth were taken to an extreme, with some enormous palatal teeth evolving. Almost all Placodonts had these crushing teeth towards the back of the jaws, with a lot of variation in the distribution and sizes of the structures, but they clearly show that these reptiles were feeding on food items that needed crunching down on, such as marine invertebrates with hard shells. A few species also had much thinner peg-like teeth at the front of the jaws too, such as the less turtle-like Placodus and Paraplacodus. These teeth were likely utilised for picking up hard-shelled prey before they were then processed by the rounder crushing teeth towards the back. Placodonts also all possess dense, thickened bones, and like the Saurosphargids, it may be that these slower-moving bottom-feeding animals ended up evolving armour as a response to predation pressure. Placodus and Paraplacodus represent the more basal lineages of true Placodonts, and within them there are then three major named families: the Siamodontids, the Placocheliids, and the Henodontids. All these groups possess some form of armour, and all have converged significantly on the turtle body plan. Siamodontids, such as Siamodus, known from Europe and China, have a completely fused carapace comprising individual armor plates that also had triangular sections projecting from the margins, giving them a very spiky appearance. There was also a separate armor shield over the pelvic region, divided from the main shield section and enabling greater flexibility in this area. The skulls of Siamodontids are very interesting too, having an overall triangular shape when viewed from above, with a very wide back, which is also covered in armoured spike structures. These armoured structures also extended in rows along the tail. The Placocheliids are also amazingly turtle-like, with fossils of this family found in Europe, China, elsewhere in Asia, and northern Africa. Some Placocheliids even possessed armour on the undersides of the body, which Siamodus didn't have, essentially convergently evolving a turtle-like plastron, which even contacted the carapace at the sides of the body. Some other Placocheliids, such as Placochelis itself, also had very short turtle-like tails. However, many still retained very long ones and had armour on them. There was also a lot of variation in the structure of the carapace among Placocheliids, with some such as Cephochelis having a relatively flat top surface, while Cephoderma had longitudinal ridges of crested osteoderms and had a separate pelvic shield, and Placochelys had many protruding structures on the top surface. Placochelid skulls are brilliantly weird things, with elongate toothless snouts and plate-like crushing teeth further back in the jaw. The purpose of those long snouts was perhaps for probing into marine sediments in search of food, which the dentition could then crunch. Some reconstructions of these animals do also make these toothless snouts look rather beak-like. Again, another potential convergence on the function of beaks in turtles. Finally, there are the Henodontids. These are some very strange creatures indeed, with fossils known from Germany and Spain. Henodus itself is the best known member of this family, and has to be one of the strangest and most fascinating of all Triassic reptiles. Henodus had a very wide carapace formed of fused osteoderms attached around the sides to a plastron underneath, and without a separated pelvic shield. Again, there was also an elongated tail with rows of armour and paddle-like limbs, but the really interesting thing about Henodus is its teeth and mode of feeding. The snout is very broad, being extended out laterally at the front, and with a highly reduced dentition compared to other Placodonts. Only a single pair of pebble-like concave teeth were present towards the back on the upper jaw, and also on the lower jaw, while the rest of the mouth was entirely toothless. However, grooves are evident along the sides of the jaws towards the front of the mouth, and striations observed within these grooves have been taken to indicate that Henodus actually had some sort of baleen analogue that it used to filter feed with. In addition, at the very front of the mouth, the premaxilla actually projects downwards and creates a very sharp cutting edge. This projecting edge even seems to have had many tooth-like denticles along its length, improving its cutting capability. So not only was Henodus filter feeding, but it was possibly also using its sharp beak analogue to scrape algae off of rocks, very similar to the modern green sea turtle with their serrated beaks. So the Placodonts were an incredible and diverse lineage of Sauropterygians, with many members again converging on the turtle body plan, and enabling these reptiles to become defended against predation as they slowly swam along, crushing hard-shelled invertebrates, and also filter feeding in the case of Henodus. Now we're going to skip forwards many millions of years to look at another very different lineage of animals that it could also be argued converged on the turtle body plan, the Glyptodonts. These heavily armoured mammals are extinct relatives of the living armadillos, and I suppose it could also be considered that modern armadillos represent yet another instance of convergence on the turtle body plan, a little bit. However, the Glyptodonts really took it to an extreme, with large and very turtle-like complete shells lacking flexible bands for mobility. Since these animals are fully terrestrial though, they have specifically converged on tortoises, with very high domed carapaces less like the more hydrodynamic, flat shells of aquatic turtles. Glyptodonts lived from the Middle Eocene epoch until the very end of the Pleistocene, existing from about 48 million years ago to just 11,000 years ago. Their shells are again formed from interlocking fused osteoderms, and would have provided them with very effective protection from potential predators. But the lack of bands in these shells would have meant that they couldn't curl up into balls like modern armadillos. They also wouldn't have been able to fully retract their heads inside the carapace like a turtle or tortoise. However, osteoderms also developed on the tops of their skulls, giving them bony caps that would have offered more protection. Very interestingly, findings published in the last decade have revealed that Glyptodonts are actually very close relatives of living armadillo lineages. It had been thought for a long time that because the armour of Glyptodonts is quite different to all living armadillos, they probably represented a sister group outside the modern lineages. However, the mitochondrial genome of a late surviving Glyptodont species was analysed in 2016, and it was discovered that these mammalian tortoise mimics are in fact deeply nested within armadillos. Specifically, they represent a subfamily within the Chlamyphorid family, the group that includes all living armadillo species except for the long-nosed or naked-tailed armadillos. Glyptodonts grew to some pretty huge sizes, with Doedicurus achieving lengths of over 3.5 meters or 12 feet, and potentially more than 2,000 kilograms in weight. The tails of Glyptodonts were also heavily armoured, and several species, including Doedicurus, even evolved tail clubs at the ends that were used to inflict powerful blows at aggressors, another convergent trait with a different group of animals, the Ankylosaurs. Speaking of which, for the sake of completeness, we should also probably take a look at the Ankylosaurs. These dinosaurs did also somewhat converge on the turtle body plan, with extensive bony armour forming from the expansion and fusion of osteoderms. These dinosaurs were a diverse lineage, originating in the mid-Jurassic and making it all the way to the end of the Cretaceous, before being wiped out with all other non-avian dinosaurs in the KPG extinction. The exact morphology, extent, and patterns of armour vary significantly among ankylosaurs, with some having extraordinary projecting spines and others appearing more conservative. Like a lot of turtles, ankylosaurs are generally very broad and their bodies are held close to the ground, and their heads are also fairly flat and broad, with osteoderms also present here. The most famous example, Ankylosaurus itself, from the latest Cretaceous of North America, is well known for having a huge tail club at the tip, like other Ankylosaurids, making them look a little less turtle-like. Although Meolania, a kind of stem group turtle, did have a sort of tail club-like structure. Ankylosaurs also didn't have anything that could be considered analogous to plastrons, leaving their undersides exposed. But then again, their fairly large sizes and extensive dorsal armour was probably more than enough to keep them protected from most predators. Now, there is actually a very interesting species of ankylosaur that has been thought to take the turtle convergence to another extreme. It's called Liaoningosaurus paradoxus, and it lived in the early Cretaceous of China. Originally named in 2001, it's a small ankylosaur, under half a meter in length, and it was initially thought that the first fossil found of it was therefore a juvenile. In 2016, paleontologists described a second small specimen of the species, and claimed to find that there were two armoured plates on the underside of the animal, looking like a plastron. Plus, they also found that fish bones were present within the ankylosaur's body cavity. They therefore took all of this, along with evidence from the tooth shape and other parts of the skeleton, and interpreted Liaoningosaurus as a small aquatic ankylosaur that swam about and ate fish. Quite a radical thing to suggest, really. This would indeed be another pretty extraordinary instance of convergence on turtles, and the paleoart produced for this 2016 paper really makes this dinosaur look incredibly turtle-like. However, many other paleontologists have since argued against this interpretation, pointing out that it doesn't really look like this dinosaur would have been an effective swimmer, with relatively small hands and feet that don't look particularly paddle-like, and with a tail that wouldn't have been very useful for propulsion either. Other features of the skull and neck bones also don't appear to have any of the modifications associated with an aquatic mode of life, and they suggest that the fish remains were actually not gut contents, but instead perhaps fish that got swept into the body cavity after death, or maybe they had been scavenging on the ankylosaur's body. Additionally, the alleged plastron has been argued to just be some preserved skin. Still, it's an interesting, if unlikely, hypothesis, and we might have had yet another example of surprisingly close convergence on turtles. So there we go then, every time that things have evolved into turtles, at least that we know of so far. I can't wait to see what turns into a turtle next. It's been very fun researching all these amazing groups of animals and revisiting turtle evolution a little bit too. I hope you've enjoyed it as well. Let me know if you'd like to see me cover other instances of convergent evolution. I think it would be quite fun to turn this into a series if people like the idea. Every time things have evolved into crabs is an obvious idea for another video, but do let me know in the comments what other cases of convergence you'd like to see. Anyway, thank you for watching, and a big thank you to our Patreon supporters, especially our Dinosaur tier supporters, Amanda von Nordek, Archianthus, Clara Middleton, Daniel Ingraham, Dhruv Shrivastava, Gary Arrington, Giortist, Greg Silvernail, Corey Peterson, Loxypoo, Mark Nevin, Mendicant Fryer, Mike Pace, Monitor Man, Persian Boy, Ralph Balzac, Robert Thomas, and Steve Bradshaw. If you would like to find out more about our world, its history, and the wonderful life that surrounds us all, please feel free to subscribe to the channel if you think we deserve it, and if you would like to see more from us.